Hello and welcome to this GSA Snapshot Webinar, where in the next 30 minutes or so, our research team will take a comprehensive look at the status of all things 5G in the roundup of the progress made in 2024. The on-demand recording of the session will be shared with you immediately following the event. You can also download the presentation at any point by moving your mouse over the slides and clicking on the download icon in the top right of the screen. There will be time for questions following the presentation, which will be about 15 minutes. So please do submit any questions as we go along using the Q&A chat box on the right side of the screen. And we'll answer as many as we can during the live event or via email afterwards. You can download the reports that lie behind these headline figures from the GSA website. In addition, if you prefer a regional focus, you can download the regional reports on Africa, APAC, Latin America, and published today on Europe. The full data sets and individual operator and device level details are all available to GSA associates and members through your subscription to the Gambod databases. First, again, a quick recap on GSA, founded back in '88, now numbering about 100 members and associates. The work of GSA includes both gathering and sharing data insights and industry advocacy. GSA has got working groups looking at key industry areas such as private mobile networks, 6G standardization, and fixed wireless access. Fixed wireless access forum itself has about 57 members representing about 8% of the ecosystem across infrastructure, chipset, module, and CPU vendors. And next week, we've actually got the plenary of the fixed wireless access forum where we'll have Ditto from the Philippines sharing their experience of fixed wireless access deployments and looking at the role that 5G RedCap has to play in that. In parallel, GSA also publishes about 160 reports based on data from our 6 Gambod databases. And you're going to get a taste of all this data really in today's presentation. And these databases, which are available to all employees of every GSA member and associate organization, contain the most up-to-date global data on 4G and 5G devices, networks, technologies, spectrum, and chipsets. So again, if your organization is a GSA member or associate, you personally have unlimited access to all this data and can use it to create your own slides and your own charts to support you in your daily work. But today, the team is taking a holistic view at the status of all the Gs at the end of 2024, providing you with the headline data that you need to guide and inform your planning for 2025 and beyond. So with that, I'll hand over to Ian from the GSA research team to take us through the data.
Thank you. So as Richard said, we have a lot of data from across the whole Gambod database in this deck. So just to set the scene at the start, we've been tracking the rollout of 5G since the beginning. At the end of 2024, we're seeing 624 operators are investing in 5G. 55% have launched commercial services. So there's ongoing momentum. 5G is in most parts of the world, but not quite everywhere yet. There's still investment and launches happening in Africa and Latin America and places. But it is pretty much everywhere now. There aren't that many gaps where there aren't at least 5G trials happening. It is in every region globally. In regions like Europe and North America, it's ubiquitous. Similarly across much of Asia and much of South and Southeastern Africa. We're tracking it everywhere. Just to remind everyone, all the data here is available in Excel or CSV format for download from the GSA website, which gives members of GSA ability to cut and slice and investigate the data at a more granular level than is available from these charts and the reports we publish. We also track spectrum in the Gambod database, and we can see some 5G bands are significantly more popular than others. N77 and N78 at the top there. You can see tremendously popular bands. There's also a lot of activity around some of the FR2 bands not so much in terms of actual commercial deployments. We track all types of bands. In this deck, because we're rounding off 5G, I'm focusing on the 5G bands. We also track older network technologies and their usage and the spectrum allocations on there too. And this is available at an operator level in the database. We also track the device landscape, not just phones, but also hotspots, modules, industrial routers, tablets, and laptops. And again, we see ongoing launches of 5G devices. It's up over 50% year on year in terms of the number of devices we have in the database. In November 2024, we reached 3,142. The proportions of devices are fairly similar. I think the interesting piece here is that the phones are staying fairly constant as a proportion. There's some moving around between the industrial router category and the FWA category, but it's staying broadly similar. Phones are still by far the biggest part, but if you look at modules and industrial routers together, they are almost 20% of the 5G devices we track. So it applies really across different sectors, not just consumer and business, but also industrial and IoT type applications as well. Standalone has been one of those areas where it's been much slower than the overall 5G market momentum. The standalone operator has to have a 5G core network. That's quite a big upgrade. It's quite complex, but it's really the foundation for many of the things that we've all been talking about for many years around 5G, around massive machine type communications, reliable low latency. Many of the vertical opportunities really benefit from having that 5G core network, and standalone is the step on that path, the foundation for doing release 17, release 18 and beyond. So we've seen now 151 operators in 63 countries are investing in standalone. This is based on data that the team has just tracked from operators globally. 31%, that represents 31% of the 624 operators that we have been tracking as known to be investing in 5G. So about a third of the operators investing in 5G are now, we can see signs of investments. We've also tracked the launches of standalone across many countries, and this is something which is ongoing. We now have over 64 operators in 35 countries having launched 5G standalone. So it's happening, may have been slow to start, but it is building momentum. And this is an important foundation for everything going forward. You can see standalone is a global trend. There are launches even in markets in poorer markets. In Philippines, there's standalone available, quite important for some of the fixed wireless access offerings there, where operators start to use RedCap, reduced capacity, reduced capability 5G devices, which needs standalone and release 17 to be in place, but offers that ability to have a device similarly priced to a 4G device. We see similar things happening in South Africa. So it's not just a developed market piece with standalone. It really depends on the market dynamics and just where the operator is in their infrastructure investment cycle. But it's happening pretty much everywhere, and it will be critical for the future. Non-standalone was great. It enabled those early 5G launches back in 2019, but standalone is really the foundation for the future. And I think it's quite interesting that when you talk to the guys involved in developing the 6G standards, there is no interest really in non-standalone around the 6G standards. I think the focus now is on a standalone type offering for 6G. And I think that again enforces why standalone is the right thing to do for operators globally as soon as they can deploy it. We also track private networks in the databases. So these are dedicated networks using 3GPP technology, so 4G or 5G, for example, where an enterprise will have a network core, network equipment, RAN sites, and their own devices connecting to it. What we have in the database are dedicated, purely standalone private networks. We also track the hybrid model, where there's a dedicated core and a dedicated network, but there's also an extension potentially onto a network slicer, onto a macro type network. We track this globally. We've been tracking this for many years. Momentum is continuing. We have the overall volume of deployments may have slightly slowed between 23 and 24. We're up to 1,603 customers with private mobile networks. But what I think is interesting under that, of course, is we're tracking the customers. Many of those customers have multiple site deployments and may have been recorded as a customer perhaps in 2023, but it continues to deploy private networks across sites during 2024. The other piece, when you look at the data in the database, is you can see there's a lot of growth on the 5G side with private networks. Many of those opportunities and capabilities around the 5G core are very attractive to private network customers because you have enhanced security, enhanced management of the network. And so there's a lot of growth within these total overall numbers in the 5G category. And just to recap, the type of networks we're tracking dedicated infrastructure and the hybrid piece. The purely public infrastructure play, like network slicing and so forth, we can see some of that through tracking standalone and through tracking deployments of the technology, but we don't have the purely virtual networks tracked in our database. So it's very much focused on new hardware, on dedicated and hybrid deployment models. In terms of the technology, I mentioned the growth was happening on the 5G side. What we can also see in the database is networks that have both 4G and 5G deployed. So you can see a snapshot of where we are at the moment on this pie chart, where just over half are purely 5G, purely 4G LTE technology, about a quarter are purely 5G, and about 1/5 are both 4G and 5G. But the growth is really coming from the 5G side. GSMR is an older 3GP technology, kind of 2G era, and that's something which is being upgraded and replaced with more modern standards as we speak and over the next few years. We also track that older technology in the database. In terms of the sectors, we track what kind of customers they are. You can see manufacturing and education at the top here, mining very strong, and then other things around defense. Defense is an interesting one. I think it's 5th in our customer tracking. There've been a lot of announcements during 2024 of defense customers, typically for 5G technology. The attraction there is the security and capability, but also that management of latency, which is useful beyond just mundane things like devices and security, but also for enabling drone platforms. So there's all kinds of interesting activity here, and this is all available again in the database for slicing and dicing and download and further investigation. We do have references which are marked as confidential. I know that's frustrating when you start looking through the data, but the thing that's nice about that is that means the database is more comprehensive, because where we're tracking information from suppliers and vendors and different sources, actually being able to get data where we aren't able to say exactly who the customer is fantastic, because it means we have a more comprehensive data set as to what sectors are happening, what technologies are being used. But all this is available again in the database, and you can see a significant proportion of those are marked as confidential, but we can still do some analysis in them, and you'll see in the database we're still able to split them by sector, as you can see on the chart here. And obviously, certain sectors you're more likely to see confidential data coming through. Again, by tracking the confidential as well as the publicly available data, it means we've got much better coverage of the full range of sectors. If we just had public data, it would bias the data set in favor of some sectors over others. Running through to our fixed wireless access data, I've just got a slide or two on it in this particular presentation. We've got a full webinar next week just diving into fixed wireless, looking particularly, I think we've got a guest speaker from Ditto, a relatively new operator, the third operator launched in the Philippines that has got a standalone network and they're using RedCap. But so have a look out for that if you're interested in fixed wireless access. In terms of our overall data set, we've got 201 operators investing in FWA globally, 169 operators, so the vast bulk of those have launched 5G FWA, up from 152 in November 2023. And really the attraction of 5G for an FWA offering is not just that 5G is faster. It's equally important that it taps into frequency bands, typically above 3 gigahertz, which have a lot of capacity and are not available to 4G, 3G or older technologies. And given the data volume on FWA tends to be greater than for a smartphone-based or an IoT-based offering, being able to use those higher capacity frequency bands is really important. I see you have a question coming in on the future of millimeter wave. So millimeter wave has been used for FWA globally. It has tremendous capacity. You typically have hundreds of megahertz available per operator. And there are some big deployments in the US and North America, particularly with millimeter wave. I think at the moment, millimeter wave, beyond an FWA use case, has been quite tricky. There's interest in industrial applications with it. On the smartphone side, most operators are still deploying their mid-band, their 3 to 6 gigahertz band 5G, and they aren't yet at capacity at that. So they don't really necessarily see much need on millimeter wave. However, in our spectrum database, we can see ongoing traction and interest momentum. There are some millimeter wave auctions coming up, I think in the UK next year. So there is interest still in the spectrum. I think it's really a timing thing about when it gets used for smartphones and when it gets used for other applications. But we're tracking all of that from what devices support millimeter wave in the Gambol database, what operators have launched it, whether it's for fixed wireless access or for other uses. But we're also tracking spectrum allocations, which are, if you think about it, an early indicator of operators' ability to launch 5G millimeter wave. So that's something that's happening. We have another question, I think, on the private network data about, what drives an enterprise to begin private networks on 5G. And I think that's also a timing thing. If you're deploying a new private network now, and you're going to put it in place and want to run it for a number of years, 5G might cost a little bit more than 4G, but it will give you a longer usable life without you needing to do big things to it. So it gives you more runway. And with a private network, enterprises don't like switching things around every year. So if you're looking at what you're doing, you're looking for a longer deployment pattern, perhaps, than you might think about for a more consumer-based service. So I think, that's one of the things that's driving it. And of course, then you've got the other capabilities that 5G can offer because of the 5G core that you just don't get with a 4G network, which again opens up opportunities, different things you can do. You might segregate traffic. You might have a factory where you have critical equipment on one slice, and then employee devices or less mission critical factory equipment on a different slice, and that's something you can only do with a 5G core. So there will be other verticals or deployments where 5G capabilities are the driver of using 5G technology, and other ones where it's just about the longevity, I think, of the piece. We're also tracking shipments of FWA CPE. This is based on a survey that we do of suppliers, of FWA suppliers. This is related to the FWA SIG, which will, again, the deeper dive presentation is next week. I'm not going to dwell on this. The data is all available. If you're interested in FWA, tune into the webinar next week. The registration's on our website. You can get much deeper into that, and there'll be other speakers on there that are probably more knowledgeable than I am on FWA. Similarly, on price trends, we're tracking the price trends, again, based on the survey. You can see the dynamics around this. You can see the 4G, 5G comparison. And of course, where that gets interesting is RedCap, which gives you that ability to get the 5G CP cost down, maybe not with the full performance of a full fat 5G offering, which you've got less antenna on there, but certainly able to tap into that new spectrum and certainly some of the other capabilities. So there's this interesting dynamic around 4G price trends for FWA CPE. 5G trends and then what Red Cat might mean for that. I think we had a question on millimeter wave earlier on. The challenge with millimeter wave typically is it's not just the network is more costly to deploy with millimeter wave, the CPE tends to be more costly as well. So that's the other dynamic there. You've got a more complex bit of equipment with additional antennas on it. So there's another interesting dynamic around why millimeter wave isn't happening so quickly. We also have data from other partners in the Gambol database. So one of those partners is OpenSignal, a mobile network analytics company focused around market performance and mobile network experience. One of the measures they have is 5G availability, which is the amount of time a device has an active 5G connection. And we've been tracking that globally. If you look at the countries, there's some slightly surprising things here. You can see very high time on 5G in India, pretty high in the US. One of the reasons for that is where standalone is happening. Because with standalone, a 5G device is always connected to 5G. It always has a 5G band allocated. If you're on older non-standalone access, a lot of the time when a device might show a 5G icon in the status bar, it doesn't actually have a 5G NR band connected to the device. It's camping on the 4G anchor band, and that doesn't count towards your time on 5G or 5G availability measure. So as more operators switch over to standalone, we will see the time that devices spend on 5G go up, which is something perhaps not so widely known. Again, all the data is in the database. I'm using country level data here, which is from July. It was collected over a 90-day period from 1st July to the end of September. There's also data on operators in the Gambol database too. Average 5G speeds are also something else that's always of interest. There's a lot of negativity still around 5G in many parts of the world, particularly in markets where the initial 5G deployments were a bit haphazard or spectrum wasn't available, and so the speeds weren't great. But when you look at what can happen with 5G when there's a good deployment, when there's proper investment put in, when the 5G specific spectrum is available, what we see in every country, in every operator, is the average 5G speeds are significantly faster than they are on 4G. Why would you need 438 megabits, which is what the average 5G speed is in South Korea, rather than 136? Well, probably certain applications, downloading big files, downloading big documents, software updates, that kind of thing. But what it also speaks to is if you've got high average speeds, the speeds at busy times of the day definitely are also tend to be higher. And the pain point might be the early evening in a congested downtown area where the network is under load and struggling. If you have a high overall average speed, you will likely still have a usable speed at those peak times. If the average speed's a bit lower, rougher, you're likely to find the network will start becoming very problematic. So these higher speeds aren't just interesting for the higher average speed overall, they indicate you're probably going to have a usable speed across all hours of day in almost every location, where a worse network, you won't have that. The other thing that's interesting here is some of the countries that are at the top of this chart. We've got places like Qatar, Guatemala. I mean, sometimes what happens there is these are new launches. I think Guatemala is very, very new. And so the availability of 5G, the reach of it's quite low, particularly in an urban area. Probably over time, as Guatemala expands its 5G coverage, we'll see them go down the rankings. But many of the countries top list, like Brazil, New Zealand, South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, UAE, have had 5G out for many years at this point, and those are probably not going to drop down the rankings. They're going to stay consistently high up. But you can also see this big multiplier difference where 5G is way, way faster than 4G, because that ability to tap into additional 5G spectrum capacity, as well as all the efficiency improvements in 5G. We see something similar on upload speed, but typically not as marked. The difference isn't as great in terms of the 5G average upload speed and the 4G average upload speed as it is on the download side. And I think that's one of the areas where there's a lot of interest when you start looking forward to the 6G discussions and standards, where there's a lot more interest in having consistently high upload speeds to support AI applications. So where the focus of the designers of 4G and 5G was really about boosting the downlink speed through things like carrier aggregation, there's a lot more focus now on improving the speed and consistency of the uplink when people look at the upcoming standards. And we can see that in some of the the discussions different GSA SIGs are having around 6G and spectrum allocations and the rest. And again, that's something, if you're interested in, don't just look at the data, have a look at the different SIGs and maybe get involved in one of them. I think we're always open to new members on each of the SIGs. Another kind of key emerging technology area is non-terrestrial network, so satellite. There's a lot of activity from multiple vendors. There are enormously excited people on the satellite side, and then there's an interesting value chain piece between the device maker, the software operating system company, and the telecom operators about who actually has that relationship with the NTN constellations. But the big thing we're tracking now is the type of services that are being launched, who's doing what, and there's a lot more happening in our data set. This is an area where, if you're interested, fire questions at us, have a look at what we have on the site. There's a satellite or an NTN report available from GSA, but there's other stuff in the GSA database. The other thing here is it also touches on our spectrum data, because what spectrum is being used for the satellite services is interesting as well. And we can see some players using regular cellular spectrum, others trying to use new spectrum. We track all of that again, and are looking to expand our coverage of NTN. And the other thing here is that many of the NTN offerings so far have been either narrowband or they've been using proprietary solutions. With release 17 of 3GP onwards, NTN is part of the 5G family. It's part of the 5G support. Release 17 is the first standard that has NTN support, but there are improvements in release 18 and beyond. And we're tracking all of that as part of the work of the GSA to drive forward the market and track what's happening with the different technologies. So with that, I think we'll go to formal Q&A. I see there's been some more questions have come through on the chat. Please use the question box on the window to put questions in. We'll do as many as we can on the webinar live, and ones we'll miss, I think we capture, and we'll try and get back to you on email afterwards. So looking through the piece, there's a question about the price of modems affecting cellular IoT. And there's discussion around what does RedCap and 5GSA do to that. Well, I think the piece on RedCap today is, with release 17, RedCap is targeting the not fully broadband, but maybe lower broadband class of devices. So things like FWA CPE, things like connected cameras. Now, those are still quite high bandwidth compared to many IoT markets. With release 18, there are enhancements to the RedCap offering that enable RedCap modules to serve less demanding IoT opportunities where they don't need such a rich solution. That also gets the price down. So I think the way to understand RedCap is it's not like many things in 3GP. It's not a single thing that we do and we forget about. There is stuff that's happening right now with CPE and other modules that's based on the RedCap standard as of release 17. But there are things happening with the release 18, the 5G advanced version of the 3GP standard, that will widen the opportunity for RedCap and enable RedCap to serve more of the legacy 4G era IoT technologies, like NB-IoT, and enable a migration path from some of those smaller bandwidth, even lower cost devices. And that's the piece to understand. The timing for that obviously is interesting. There's a question here about, as 5GSA expands, when do you estimate LTE or 4G networks to be sunset, to be switched off, basically? So we have data on the switch-offs of 2G and 3G networks. We're tracking a lot of switch-offs. There's a lot happening. There seems to be a peak happening in 2024 and 2025. And one of the drivers for that is that if you switch off 2G and 3G, you can repurpose that capacity for 4G or most likely 5G. And that really helps you with the standalone launch, because if you're an operator and you're flipping on standalone, a smartphone device connected to a standalone cell and a standalone core network can no longer leverage the 4G frequency bands that might be available from that cell, which means if there isn't enough 5G NR capacity, the risk is the actual average speed might drop compared to a non-standalone 5G service. So by switching off 2G and 3G and repurposing that to 5G NR, an operator moving on with standalone can make sure the standalone average speed for those users connected to standalone is at least as good, if not significantly better, than a non-standalone solution. So that's the real driver. I think in terms of 4G switch-offs, I think we're some way off that. The fact that 4G and 5G have very good interoperability means, I think, and 4G has been an incredibly popular standard globally and has worked really well. I think we're not seeing any signs of early sunsets outside a few edge cases, I think, globally. It may well be on the private network side that there are some early 4G networks where an enterprise goes, we really, really want the 5G core, and we're going to flip off our 4G private network and make it entirely 5G. I think that's more likely to happen than on the macro networks. Looking down the other list of questions. What are the kind of services driving the very high 5G download speeds in these countries? And do you expect them to continue to increase or stabilize to a certain level? So I think a lot depends on the spectrum available with 5G. We saw some markets in Latin America, South America, and North America that launched 5G without significant amounts of new mid-band spectrum. And typically the offerings were a similar performance level in terms of speed to 4G. As soon as they could add in new capacity, new spectrum capacity, the speeds went up. And I think what we'll see globally in terms of the speed evolution is when a market first launches, you often get very high speeds because 5G is in a very small area of the country. Then it slows down a bit overall as you get the network rolling out, you get more users onto the network. And then what happens, it depends on the relationship between rising data consumption and ability to add new 5G capacity. If operators are able to switch off 2G and 3G and put either 4G or 5G on them, 4G and 5G are way more efficient, so they can support more users and more data volume than can older 2G or 3G. So you're adding effectively spectrum capacity. And it's that relationship between the supply of spectrum, the quality of the backhaul of the cells and the peering, and the rising data consumption. It depends on what that relationship is. Do the operators add more spectrum, more capacity more quickly than data volume and users go up? And it will really depend on the operator and the market, how that plays out. Operators that have got good ARPU levels, so in Japan or North America, Canada and places like that, have a better business case for then pushing up network investment to meet and serve demand. If you've got a market where ARPU levels are low, there are 4 or 5 operators in the market, and therefore the user base is split, it's harder to build the case for those investments. But it's that dynamic about how quickly you can add spectrum and capacity versus rising data consumption. I think we've done most of the key questions. There may be some others kicking around there. I think we're at the point where we want to roll over and close the call. And if you've got other questions, do get in touch with us. Have a look on the GSA website. The questions we haven't answered in the Q&A in the question panel, we'll try and get back to you after the call. So I'm going to hand back to Richard for closing comments.
Great, thank you, Ian. And again, I'll just close today by thanking our research team, both Ian and Jordan behind the scenes, frantically answering questions online as well. And thank you for joining us today. After the event, you will receive a link to the webinar recording and to the presentation. As we've alluded to, we have one more event this year, and that's the plenary, the Fixed Wireless Access Forum next week. And they'll be joined by operators, including Ditto in the Philippines, and digging into the industry-defining topics that are shaping 5G fixed wireless access deployments. As we've pointed out throughout, access to detailed data behind these charts that you've seen today is available to all employees of GSA members and associates via the GSA website and the Gambods database. If you'd like more information about how your organization can get involved in GSA and access all 6 of the databases, please do get in touch via info@ gsacom.com. For the latest updates on our research activities and events, you can follow us on our social channels. And also, if you go to the website, gsacom.com, you can sign up for the weekly Research Digest email and to the monthly newsletter. So you get all the reports delivered direct into your inbox. So finally, on behalf of the GSA team, I'll just say thank you again for joining us. And we hope to see you again soon at the next GSA event. Many thanks.